They don't have many towns.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming inside on a beautiful fall Sunday afternoon to share and listen to some stories with us. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones. I work here at the Oregon Historical Society, where our mission is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all of the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. So we do that work in a lot of ways. Our museum here, there are 3 full floors of museum exhibits. We have online resources, the Oregon History Project and the Oregon Encyclopedia. Our journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, has been published continuously since 1900, and it's always been a benefit of membership with the Historical Society. We also do public programs like this one. This is part of our Second Sunday series, so it happens every month except May, because that's Mother's Day. But we always have free public programs that are happening here at the Historical Society on the second Sunday of the month, so keep an eye out for that. In October, we'll have historians Joe Ogden and Kimberly Jensen talking about the subject of race and resistance in the early 20th century. And then in November, it'll be the last day for the John F. Kennedy exhibit, High Hopes. And on that day, we're going to have a group of musicians come and do protest songs. So some from the 60s and some from present day. So it'll be a bit of a fun time. You should come join us for that. Our work here also involves a lot of work with educators and school children. We will be beginning over the next few weeks to begin to see the school kids come in and fill up the rooms again, which we love. We also have traveling trunks on a wide variety of Oregon history topics that we send out throughout the state. So we're very busy here. We're so appreciative of the support from all of our corporate and individual and grantor, sponsors, and donors, and also our Oregon Historical Society members. Thank you all so much for your membership. And Multnomah County residents who have voted to renew a modest property tax levy that supports OHS and 4 historical societies in East Multnomah County. I mention that first to say thank you, Multnomah County residents, and also make sure you know that you have free admission to the Historical Society Museum all the time, and you have discounts on your membership. One last thing I should mention is that our research library, which is the largest collection of material related to the history of the Oregon country anywhere in the world, is open to the public. You don't need a reservation. You can just come in and talk to the research librarians, and they'll get you started on your research. So be sure to take advantage of that. We are so happy to have our fearless leader, Kerry Tymchuk, as our host for today's program. Kerry has been Executive Director here at the Historical Society since May 2011, so we're celebrating 6 years with Kerry. Prior to that, he spent 25 years in the political arena, serving as a top aide and advisor to United States Secretary of Labor Elizabeth Dole, United States Senator Bob Dole, and United States Senator Gordon Smith. He is a native of Reedsport, Oregon, a 5th-generation Oregonian, a graduate of Willamette University and Willamette University College of Law, and he is a person who sees absolutely the best in everyone. Please join me in welcoming Kerry Tymchuk.
Well, thank you and welcome. We wanted to do this because we kept hearing people wanting to share their stories. The Kennedy exhibit, High Hopes, which opened in late March, has been, I think, our most popular exhibit perhaps in the history of OHS. The number of people coming through, it's here until November 12th. And people come through and they want to share their stories of, they saw JFK when he was campaigning here. And you saw the list in there of all the places he went, a phenomenal amount of cities that Kennedy visited when he was campaigning. Back in the old days, the Oregon primary meant something in 1960. Nowadays, the primary is too late in the process, the nomination's already over. But in 60, Kennedy's campaign theory was he had to run and win everywhere to prove that a Catholic could win. So he ran in Wisconsin, and he ran in West Virginia, where Catholics had not won before. And he ran in Oregon. Everybody else stayed out because Wayne Morris, one of our senators, was running as a favorite son, candidate for president. And Kennedy came to Oregon to prove that he could win in Oregon and beat the senator, came to many times over 58, 59, and 60, went to Pal Butte, Pendleton, LeGrand, Coos Bay, Tillamook, went throughout the state. Imagine the presidential candidate coming into Oregon today and doing that. And the voters rewarded Kennedy by giving him the Oregon primary. It was the last primary before the convention, Democrat Convention 60, credited with creating a sense of momentum that made his nomination inevitable. So he was very indebted to Oregon for winning. Wayne Morris never forgave Kennedy for beating him. He never forgave Edith Green, the congresswoman, for endorsing Kennedy over him, but Kennedy did win Oregon. He would narrowly lose Oregon to Nixon in the 60. Back then, Oregon was a little more of a Republican state than it is today, and Nixon actually beat Kennedy narrowly in Oregon. But people coming through have been wanting to share their memories of meeting Kennedy, seeing Kennedy, how he inspired them to enter the Peace Corps. Oregon is one of the top states in the nation per capita for Peace Corps volunteers. Part of Oregon's, ethic, I think, of serving others, of asking not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And of course, everybody of a certain age and above, I won't name the age, remembers exactly where they were when they heard the news of the president's assassination. And people have been sharing those memories with us as well. So we thought it might be fun to open an open mic so much so this is all about you today, the program, can share your thoughts and memories and reflections on the life and the legacy of President Kennedy. The exhibit runs through November 12th. We are very excited, of course, as I hope all of you know, to have Caroline Kennedy, Ambassador Caroline Kennedy, will be here in a little over 9 days on Tuesday, September 19th to speak. She's going to tour the exhibit and then speak at the Schnitz. We have all but sold out. I think we've sold 2,600 or 2,700 tickets. There may be a handful left to see Ambassador Kennedy, and she'll speak, and then she and I will have a conversation on stage. She'll also tour the exhibit with the members of the Mark family. The one downside, of course, is Pete Mark, who was the collector. This is the 5th exhibit we've done with his collection. Pete passed away in June at the age of 91. He was so looking forward to meeting Ambassador Kennedy and showing her the exhibit, but his 3 children now will join us for the tour. But I can't help but look out every time I look on the terrace, I think of Pete, because Pete called me, maybe 5 weeks before his passing, and said, I want red geraniums on the terrace when Caroline is here to make the terrace look great. And he said, and oh, by the way, I have a geranium person. Pete had a person for everything. The awnings out front. He called me one day and said, we need awnings. I have an awning person for you. So he called me and said he had a geranium person. The day after his memorial service this past June, Pete's geranium person was here planting those geraniums out there. So I'll think of him when he's here, when Caroline is here in September, or in 9 days, and think about Pete. He'll be with us in spirit. But, I think the best, Kennedy remains just a topic of endless fascination for the American public. Polls of the American public continue to rate him as one of our greatest presidents, just below Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln. Polls of scholars rate Kennedy as an above-average president, but not a great president. But in the American public's mind, he remains one of our greatest presidents. His average approval rating during his time in office was 70% plus. Imagine that today. Imagine 40% today, but at 70%, Americans had just united behind an affection, an admiration of their young, youthful president. His family, of course, played a big part. Jackie, who became First Lady at the age of 31. She became First Lady. She was 12 years younger than President Kennedy. His 2 children, Caroline and John, of course, enchanted the public. In the exhibit is the album, or the record, The First Family. Do you remember that? It was the fastest-selling record at its time ever. It was a gentle spoof of the Kennedys, and that became a national sensation. The best, I think, we end the exhibit with a quote from historian Alan Brinkley, and I wanted to read it because I think it really summarizes best the Kennedy legacy. And he wrote, many people saw President Kennedy as a president who would have transformed the nation and the world had he lived. He reminds many Americans of an age when it was possible to believe that politics could speak to society's moral yearnings and be harnessed to its highest aspirations. More than anything, perhaps, John Kennedy reminds us of a time when the nation's capacities looked limitless, when its future seemed unbounded, when Americans believed that they could solve hard problems and accomplish bold deeds. And perhaps that's the best legacy of John Kennedy. So with that, let me open it up and see. Margaret, do you want to start? The wonderful history maker Margaret Carter, the first African-American woman ever elected to an Oregon state legislative position, is right here. Former State Senator Margaret Carter. and a member of our OHS Board of Directors. And Margaret, I believe you would have been in Louisiana back in 1963.
That's right.
And what are your memories?
Well, my memories.
Stand up.
Thank
Yes,
you
yes.
very much. And thank you guys for coming. The board really appreciates your being involved. And for anybody that has not joined the organization, please join with us today.
How about that? They're right there. So, yeah. So.
He didn't tell me that either,
No,
by
so.
the way. Anyway, it's quite interesting because I was a young mother at the time, the same age as Jacqueline Kennedy at 31 at that time. And the news came on, a baby was crying, and I'm trying to take care of the baby, but I hear this news on the TV, and poor little baby had to wait for a few minutes. And when I know anything, I'm crying, and the baby is crying, the baby stopped crying to look at me crying. And I'm sure it was all because the baby thinking I'm crying because she's crying. But it was the most bleak day of my life. It was like it turned dark in Louisiana. And don't forget, at that particular time, we were living in a very, very segregated city and state in Louisiana. But it didn't matter. What's interesting, Kerry, because you found on the corners black people, white people, everybody together mourning over the loss of our dearest president.
So, thank you. Anybody else? Raise your hand here. Other reflections. Did anybody meet President Kennedy? Did they see him when he was in Oregon? Were they inspired to run for office, like State Representative Mitch Greenlick here from Portland? Mitch, do you have any memories?
Yes, I remember obviously the day he died and where I was at that point, but more importantly, I remember hearing his inaugural address. And I think it really changed my life listening to him and the Ask Not. I had been trained as a pharmacist. I was teaching. I was working on my PhD at that time. And I was very much a child of the Eisenhower administration. And that essentially brought people my age into the new world. And it was extraordinary for me.
So one of the great Portland connections is I think one of the best restaurants in Portland is Andina. Everyone knows Andina, the Peruvian restaurant. Well, the owner-operator of Andina, he went to the Peace Corps, and in Peru, where he met his wife, and then came back here to Portland and opened up the restaurant there that's so popular here. So another little connection there for Kitty and the Peace Corps. Anybody else? Come on, raise your hand. Right here. Thank you.
I was in 6th grade when President Kennedy was killed. And we were in Mass. I was at the St. John Fisher Catholic School, and we were in Mass, and this was a long time ago, and someone actually came up on the altar, walked up on the altar, and interrupted Father saying Mass. Well, that had never happened, so we knew something was going on, and Father stopped Mass. He turned around to all of us. This is when the priests were still facing the altar, and he said, "Boys and girls, bow your heads and pray the president has been shot." And about 20 minutes later, same person came, and I saw Father's head drop like this. And he turned around. He turned around with tears in his eyes, and he said, "Boys and girls, please pray for our country. The president is dead." So we filed out down to our classrooms, and there was an announcement that school was over. And when we walked outside, all of our moms were in their station wagons, ready to pick us up with tears running down their face. And I will never forget that. It was the first time I ever saw my dad cry. So it was a very emotional day, and it was a day that had me think about service and what I wanted to do with my life and how I could give back. And I'm always grateful for that because it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to give service, and it's been a great life doing that. So thank you.
And it's hard to remember what a big deal it was to have a Catholic elected president there. One of the items in the exhibit is a flyer that the Oregon Masonic Lodge put out, which is you just cannot believe how vicious it is. But you cannot vote for Kennedy because he's a Catholic. The Pope and the Vatican are going to run things. And as a young Catholic back then, what was it like to have a Catholic elected president?
Oh, it was really exciting, but the funny thing was the nuns all were Democrats and voted for Kennedy. It was very clear. But some of the pastors were Republicans, and they voted for Nixon. And I don't think the nuns ever forgave them. But it was a huge deal to have a Catholic elected president. I mean, it was huge.
Yes, and right here, Eliza, can you?
Hi. I was president of my junior high school and in science class when the teacher's radio came on with the news. And they called me into the office and said that I needed to make an announcement to the school over the PA. So that was that was the hardest thing I had to do as, you know, a student body president. My father, inspired by Kennedy, was in his first session as a state representative from Southwest Washington. So, like you, I saw my father cry for the very first time. And he took our family to Olympia to an ecumenical service in the state capitol. So I have pretty potent memories, and I think I kept a journal. I haven't looked at it in years, but I think I kept a journal of those days when my family was glued to the TV like so many families were. And when the country, we all were glued to the TV and watching this unfold.
Absolutely. So, and one of the rare items, if you haven't gone through the exhibit yet, one of the amazing items is the CBS TV camera that filmed Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald and broadcast it live to the country at that time. One of the amazing items from the Mark collection. So, others. There's the microphone. Yes.
Hello, I am David Hansen. I'm the son of former Congresswoman Julia Butler Hansen, who served in Congress from 1960 through 1974. And my mother was elected the same night that John Kennedy was elected president, November 8th, 1960. I well remember that night. And then several days later, a telegram came to the house, a congratulatory telegram from JFK, congratulating my mother on winning the unexpired term and then the full term. And that was really an exciting time for me, for a boy, 14, in Cathlamet, Washington, which was a small town, 500 people, to have, you know, the president-elect of the United States send a telegram. And in those days, telegrams were delivered, and of course, my granddaughters don't even know what a telegram is. But I remember we went to Washington, and we lived in Georgetown, not far from where JFK lived, and I attended the inauguration that day, January 20th, 1961. It had snowed about a foot or more the night before, and the city was paralyzed. 5 snowflakes fell in Washington, and the city was paralyzed. But I remember sitting on the bleachers in front of on the East Plaza of the Capitol and witnessing all the ceremonies, and then his magnificent speech, which is one of the great speeches in American history, along with Lincoln's 2 inaugural addresses and Franklin Roosevelt's and some of the revolutionary. And then I remember, and I have a number of pens and other mementos that the president used to sign my mother's legislation, and 6 or 7 pictures. And then in the June of 1961, he sent my mother an autographed copy of Profiles in Courage, and it was a very exciting time. And when I was 15, I remember going to a concert at the White House the first time that I had been, and the president came out and addressed us about about the arts and the importance of the arts. And Mrs. Kennedy came out, and she was wearing a beautiful yellow dress, and so those years are etched indelibly in my memory. And of course, I was there when the tragic news came of the assassination, and that Saturday we drove to the White House. It was raining, and my mother went in. It was such a traumatic time that I didn't go in, which now I later regret, but it was unbelievable for those of us who remember that. So it was a great time, and one can always remember his voice, and that wonderful voice, and his sense of humor, that self-deprecating humor. I remember one time mother told about the time that she, I think, first went to the Oval Office, and he told her, he said, well, I understand, Mrs. Hanson, that your family's from Massachusetts. And my mother said yes, because our people had settled in Massachusetts. They were one of the founders of Groton. And then he was explaining how his great-grandfather had come from Ireland in 1848. And my mother said, well, that's 200 years after my family. And the president had some witty remark to that, because, of course, he was famous for his sense of humor. But anyway, this exhibit was wonderful and brought back a lot of memories of when we lived during the years of the new frontier. Thank you.
Great story. Do you have your mother? Did you keep these items? Your mother's archives?
Oh yes,
today?
yes.
So, yeah.
She would bring these home, and I would take them and secrete them away in a trunk. So I have a whole trunk of what I call the memories of Camelot. Right.
And you've got some people in the back who'll probably buy those from
Right, including a Christmas card that Jackie and the president sent to all the Democratic members of Congress. Mother said he made Jackie sign them, because, of course, she was not particularly, she wasn't really political, but the president was. He was a professional politician. So anyway, thank you.
And we're honored to have with us today some members of the Oregon Political Collectors Association, I think, and with some wonderful items back there. And I see my pal Carl Wolfson back there. Eliza, take the microphone back to Carl. Carl, great radio host here in Portland, and then great political collector. So.
Thank you, Kerry. This is the Oregon chapter of the American Political Items Collectors. Grant, John, what's your wife's name? I'm sorry. Mary, and Carl Fisher and Carl Wolfson here. And we have brought material from our political button and memorabilia collections. And I have a canvas of my JFK buttons that you can see on the way out. I do want to do a plug. I have a book coming out, and Kerry, it's due out on Thanksgiving, and I know the big Festival of Books is right here on December 3rd. And it's kind of a childhood memoir, and my recollection of the Kennedy assassination is in that book. So you have to buy the book to hear it. Thank you.
But Carl, how many, if you haven't seen a political button collection until you've seen Carl's, how many political buttons do you have?
I have over 21,000 in my collection. I'm putting them all on different canvases, and I'll eventually have about 500 canvases. I've got about 200 done. They're in storage in the Southeast, because I don't want to break up my marriage if I keep them all at home. John Gerhardt had one of the greatest. I think John and Carl, I'm sure, have more Oregon buttons. I have about 500 to 600 different Oregon buttons. And how many do you have, Carl?
Oh, most of my collection is entirely Oregon.
And John had one of the great collections. So a lot. How long have you been part of American Political Items Collectors, John? John's kind of like the holy grail of collectors in Oregon, early 70s, and I joined in 76. And John has a Cox Roosevelt button, which is the holy grail for button collectors. And how much is that worth now, John? A lot. I think it's between 20 and 30,000 for that one button, because very few were minted. But stop by on the way and check it out. And if you'd like to join and start collecting political memorabilia, and I have two Julia Hanson Butler buttons that I didn't bring with me. So I know she made at least two different ones. I wish I'd brought them so you could see them. Thank you very much.
So, and that collecting reminds me, next Sunday here at OHS is our third annual What's It Worth? It's our version of the Oregon, or of the Antique Roadshow. We have a team of appraisers here for a variety of items, and we invite people to come in and bring their treasures for a non-legally binding, non-enforceable estimate of what your item costs. And we've done it for 2 years in a row, had a lot of fun with it, and people have really found some treasures. Some guy brought in a signed baseball that was signed, I believe, by Lou Gehrig, and it's probably $10,000 is what he was told is what it's worth. So that's next Sunday from, I think, noon to 5. So if you've got something at home, little treasures, bring them in. Other thoughts, other memories. We're off to a good start. Yes, right here.
Probably the only time I regretted not having a television. was a freshman in college, didn't have a television, or my roommates, and so we missed out a lot on that weekend because we had to go find a television to watch any coverage. I went to Texas this spring for the first time, to Dallas, and I would like to recommend the museum that they have in the book depository. It's a wonderful exhibition of the times, and they start out kind of describing what the 60s were, and I thought, oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of people who didn't live in the 60s, and they have to be brought back through albums of music covers and so on to remind them what the time was like. But I did learn from the guide, who's read many, many books on the assassination, a little bit about Jack Ruby, and I've never taken the time to learn much about him, but he got involved in this because he was well known for thinking the Kennedys were just the most superb people on the face of this earth, and he was a big fan of the president. He called Mrs. Kennedy America's princess. So he thought that if he would kill this assassin, he would save Jackie Kennedy the grueling time to be in court. Very interesting.
Thank you. Others, other thoughts, memories? Don't be shy. Yes, go ahead, Liza. So.
I was working in Cleveland, Ohio at the time of Kennedy's assassination, and having been brought up Republican, even though I had seen John F. Kennedy when he was campaigning, he came to Miami of Ohio University, and we got the morning off from classes to go to the stadium and hear him speak. I was still a Republican at heart, but I had gone, on the day of his assassination, I had gone to a very large shopping mall, and I had taken the escalator up to the second floor, which was a large mezzanine with all the television sets, and you can imagine the size of the TVs at that time. And the announcement had just occurred, and all these people were standing in front of these television sets, and I've never seen so many people crying. And here it was on TV, and it was just this multimedia experience, and it was just very, very memorable.
It was really the incident that brought TV into that, the forefront, that every American had to have a television to be part of this national catharsis going on that whole weekend. Yeah. All the stations suspended no commercials, for those almost 4 days of just wall-to-wall news coverage. Since 2 weeks, similar to 9/11, more recently. So, anybody else want to share a memory back there?
I'm too young to remember Kennedy. However, I do have a picture that my grandfather took of him at inauguration at Whiskeytown Lake, probably about a month before he was assassinated.
That was down in California, correct? So yes, he went there for the opening of this watershed, as I recall. Another very different time in American politics, when the President of the United States would go to the opening of a watershed in California. I mean, back nowadays, you just couldn't imagine that. Other? Yes, Jim.
Thank you, Kerry. Rather than tell the story about the day Kennedy died, let me tell you when he was running for president, as a young Catholic man, it was pretty cool. And probably because my mother was the Democratic, just neighborhood precinct committee woman, probably because she had 6 kids to run all that material around the neighborhood. And so, we were pretty heavily involved. God, I wish we would have kept half the pamphlets and pins that we had at the time, because now I find out they have value. But the point was, it was a time to really, for me and my sisters, to really learn a lot about Oregon history. For example, as you mentioned today, the effort on behalf of the Masons to take apart the Kennedy campaign. When I would say to my dad, "What's that all about?" And he would, that's how I learned when I was a sophomore in high school, that the Masons really ran the state at one time, and they ran it, and then he told me the story. He said they were so powerful that they actually came close to closing the Catholic schools. And I said, really? That would have saved me a lot of grief. But no, he said, no, the governor was a guy named Pierce or something, and you better be careful, Jimmy, because if you cross the sisters, they'll sue you. And that's fact, that one of the biggest cases that you learn about if you study constitutional law is a case called Pierce versus the Society of Sisters, who, unwound what was going on in Oregon, and it's actually a great case about religious liberty. So it was amazing to me that in the context of trying to get this John F. Kennedy elected president, that I actually learned a whole bunch of stuff about Oregon history, only to be reminded about it as Kerry's up there throwing out these anecdotes and bromides.
As Jim said, in the 1920s, Oregon voters passed a law banning private schools in Oregon, aimed at banning Catholic schools is what they went after, but it was banning all private schools. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court would rule that as unconstitutional, as should have. But imagine Oregon voters passing that. Kind of scary. Right behind you, Liza. So.
Thanks. There's a lot of Kennedy books here. Andrew just grabbed one, a biography about Monroe Sweetland, and some of you, Mitch Greenleaf, probably knew Monroe Sweetland. He really built up the modern Oregon Democratic Party starting in the 1930s. And he was very active on the Kennedy campaign. Edith Green was the chair, but Monroe was a very active organizer. And there's a picture of Monroe and Kennedy in that book, so hope you'll consider buying that.
Good, it's a great book by Monroe, so yes, about Monroe, so. Others who want to share? Otherwise, we'll let you loose and go through the exhibit again and go see the pins in the collection back there. Eliza is the editor of our Oregon Historical Quarterly. Any historical thoughts that you have to share on Kennedy and what it meant to the public? So
it's been fascinating having the exhibit here and having people tell some of their stories. And I think for me, the title of the exhibit is so good because there really were these high hopes for this young president. My guess is that the reasons scholars don't rank him higher is that he didn't have enough time. And so there's always that debate about, historians will say, well, you can't have a counterfactual. We can't say, well, X would have happened if Y hadn't, because we don't know what would have happened. So I think it's the attention to a president like this has been really fascinating to have here and to think about, I think, in our own times, how much a single person can transform a nation and a citizenry, and it's really been wonderful to have this here to reflect on these days. So.
And one of the speakers we had in our Hatfield series last spring, many of you might have been there, was this Jeff Greenfield, the CNN correspondent, who wrote a book called If Kennedy Had Lived, and theorized what would have happened. Fascinating lecture had he lived, because he had his problems with Congress, of course. The big Southern Democrats who controlled all the committees, including the Judiciary Committee, were not allowing any civil rights bills to pass. And it was LBJ who got him passed as a memorial to the martyred president. And much of Kennedy's agenda didn't happen until after he passed, which LBJ rammed through. So Anything else? Other thoughts? Good for the order? So, well, if not, thanks for coming, and we'll let you loose. I mean, if you haven't been to the exhibit, or even if you have been, go in again. Be sure and watch the movie. There's a 10-minute video loop. Kennedy's inaugural, the Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which apparently means I am a jelly donut, and and the famous tour that Jackie gave of the White House in 1962. And go back and look at these wonderful items back here from our collectors, and thank you for coming. Find your space.
That was great. You know what? I really feel that in the sound that you kind of change.
Oh, it's